Hi, I'm Chip Rogers, and welcome to the AAHOA Educational Experience. This week we are talking about labor issues again. In our previous show, we discussed at length the National Labor Relations Board with my guests, and I'll introduce them now. Bob Sullivan with R.G. Sullivan Consulting, LLC, specializing in labor and employment practices. And of course, Laura Lee Blake with AAHOA, the Asian American Hotel Owners Association. She is Vice President for Fair Franchising, Government Affairs, and General Counsel. And we spoke at length again about the National Labor Relations Board, which is supposed to be the independent agency that kind of referees the fight between labor and employers. In the last few years, it's kind of gone to one side, I think most people would agree. But maybe for some of our viewers, who have not experienced this, they'd like to know, what is the actual process for a labor election? If you're a non-labor business and now someone's attempting to unionize you, how does that actually work, Bob?
Well, there are two ways in which it can work. One is the most common, and that's the secret ballot election. It is lawful, even today and even without the Employee Free Choice Act that we've talked about, for an employer to recognize a union based on signed cards. And there are certain safeguards that have been in place for that. It's a relatively rare practice. But generally what happens is if a union gets interest among employees that it wants to organize, they have the employees sign representation cards, and under the law, if they get more than 30% of the employees they seek to represent to sign cards, they have a sufficient showing of interest to file a petition for election with the National Labor Relations Board. When that happens, the employer gets notified and then begins an interactive process where a board agent works to make sure that the board has jurisdiction over the employer, defines the appropriate group of employees, which would make up the collective bargaining unit, and then schedules a secret ballot election, which is conducted by an agent of the NLRB. It's a very elaborate process, but essentially, regardless of what employees might have said in the past or whether they signed a card or not, they have the right to come and mark a secret paper ballot and put it into a ballot box so no one can know how they voted. And if a union gets a majority of those casting votes, then the union ultimately can be certified. And if it's less than a majority voting for the union, then the union loses the election.
I want to follow up on that quickly before I go to Laura Lee, because the notion that a card check process, and I understand it is legal in certain cases, but under EFCA it would essentially have been the way that these elections are held from now on, in most cases I would assume. I think of an election as, all right, we have an issue, everybody's been informed, we've had time to consider it, now everybody go vote. Under card check, essentially you could have someone sign a card today and a long period of time go by and another person sign the last card that's necessary to unionize. But what happens if the first guy that signed the first card really didn't want to do it anymore? I mean, it doesn't seem like there's an election anymore. It seems like a process of gathering cards, isn't it?
Well, that's true. And the answer to what happens actually just recently changed as a result of a ruling by the current National Labor Relations Board. Until the recent case of Le Mans Gasket, if an employee didn't like the fact that a union had been certified on the basis of card check, the employee could file a petition with the National Labor Relations Board asking for a secret ballot election. In Le Mans Gasket just recently, the NLRB threw out that procedure and essentially said, no, on the basis of card check, you're stuck with the union and you don't have a right to ask for an election if you don't like the result.
Wow. So, Laura Lee, I know you have a story about a lady who was involved in this, and I think it perfectly illustrates perhaps how this thing has gotten out of balance recently.
Right. There was an article that recently appeared in the Washington Examiner, and it was a letter written by Barbara Ivy. It was just dated October 18, 2011, so just a few weeks ago. And the title of the article was "The NLRB Canceled My Vote." And she talked about that she had worked for Kaiser Permanente for 21 years, and she was suddenly informed that the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, had showed up and they were launching a card check drive at her workplace. So following a 13-day campaign, company officials announced that now they were unionized because they had collected enough cards, as Bob was talking about. She said that in Oregon, where she's located, this means that everyone, including those of us who didn't want to join this union, will have to pay union dues and accept union bargaining just to keep our jobs. She said during the union campaign, union organizers can pressure employees face to face until they sign cards, and that they are then counted as yes votes for the unionization. In this article, she actually mentioned that she was strongly suspicious of this whole campaign because she said she was actually never even approached by the union organizers to sign cards. So she wondered how in the world they got enough, cards signed to actually accomplish this. But she said she was worried enough about the fact that now they were suddenly a certified union that she went and talked to the National Right to Work Foundation and decided to collect signatures for a decertification of the election. And it's a similar process. If you can collect enough signatures from employees that don't want to be part of the union, you can then force a secret ballot vote to determine what would happen. So she said she collected enough signatures to trigger the vote, and the NLRB scheduled a secret ballot election for October 4. She said, my coworkers and I, we were eager to have our say, but then she said the NLRB called the whole thing off before they could ever go forward with the vote, and she said, I just found out why. She said in the Le Mans gasket case, the NLRB voted 3-1 to overturn this precedent that allowed workers to decertify a vote. And so she said now they were forced to live with whatever the union was mandating for them for the next 4 years before they would have a voice. And so this raises obviously serious concerns not only for employers but for employees that in the past had an opportunity that if they didn't agree with this that they could force a secret ballot vote so that employees that maybe were compelled to sign the cards, pressurized, intimidated to sign the cards, could go in and still cast their real vote to have a say in what would happen at their workplace.
So, Bob, it sounds like the moral of the story is that the employee's voice needs to be heard if it's in favor of the union. But if the employees decide that that's not what they want, then we're not to listen to their voice. I mean, is that the message coming from the NLRB?
It is. It is. The NLRB most recently has been issuing rulings and proposed regulations that give a voice to union organizers and essentially don't want to hear from employers or employees that oppose the union.
And that certainly seems to be the direction they're going. And I want to follow up on that when we come back from the break because we have run out of time here for the first segment. But we've got a lot more to talk about. This is an issue that probably impacts the individual businesses that you're involved with more than you know, and certainly impacts the national economy that has been limping along for quite some time now. I'm Chip Rogers for AAHOA. We'll take a quick time out and be back right after this. Welcome back. I'm Chip Rogers with AAHOA. We are talking about labor relations, discussing the issue of card check and the secret ballot. My guest again this week, Bob Sullivan. Thank you for being with us. And Laura Lee Blake, thank you. The issue of secret ballots, whether it be, I think most Americans would be appalled if they thought they couldn't have a secret ballot to vote for the President of the United States. Yet we are supposed to accept the fact that we can't have secret ballots for labor elections. And a few states in this past election, in the 2010 election, took it upon themselves to enact state constitutional amendments to protect the right to a secret ballot. I believe in the 4 states that it was on the ballot, it passed in all 4 by overwhelming numbers. The people in those states clearly understand the theory behind I want to have a secret ballot in all elections. Yet now you have the federal government going after the independent states for what's in their state constitution. I would think that's clearly a violation of the spirit of the 10th Amendment. Mm-hmm. But isn't this just another and a multi-year series of actions with the federal government taking actions against the individual states on issues they don't like, Laura Lee?
Yes, and what we're seeing is that the NLRB General Counsel, it's a man by the name of Leif Solomon, is just being as aggressive as the board is. And apparently he sent letters to the 4 states that had enacted this legislation, to the attorney generals of Arizona, South Carolina, South Dakota, and Utah. And he said that they are going to be filing complaints against Arizona and South Dakota, apparently to save resources. Right now they're not going after South Carolina and Utah. So we'll have to monitor how these lawsuits progress and what this means in these particular states.
It just, you know, I don't know whether those are red or blue states, but it just seems amazing to me that the state would take an independent action through their own state constitution, and you have a federal government trying to supersede the will of not just the legislature in those states, not the executive branch in those states, but the actual will of the people in those states. That seems to be an extraordinary step in this area of labor versus employers. I mean, this is almost historic, isn't it?
It is. It's one of many things that rise to historic levels that the board and the general counsel have been doing. But it really goes to point out the importance that people place on the secret ballot. In fact, I know surveys have shown that among union households, they overwhelmingly want to protect the secret ballot election, because whether you're for or against being unionized, everyone understands that you should be able to vote free of coercion.
And let's talk about a term that has come up recently, and this is an act that's being taken, or a rule that's being put forth by the NLRB called snap elections, or these short elections. How does that change the nature of the way things are today and what they would like to see happen?
What's happened is the NLRB has issued what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking. And that's just part of the regulatory process where they draft changes to the regulations, and in this instance, to the way that union elections are conducted, and they put them out for public comment. So the proposed rulemaking is pending right now. The period for public comment has ended, and many people did submit their comments to the board. And it remains to be seen whether the board will enact or allow the regulations as proposed to take effect, or withdraw them or modify them. But in effect, what the board is trying to do is force elections to take place much more quickly than they have historically, from an average of a little over 30 days between the filing of a petition and the actual election to as little as 10 days. And also the board is looking to impose many more burdens on employers in responding to charges, in raising legal issues, and at the threat of waiving any issues not raised within the very first document filed with the board before an election.
Laura Lee, doesn't this, it seems to play into this narrative that those who are seeking to unionize, they're not so concerned with the process, they're simply concerned with reaching the results that they desire. And I mean, whether it's these snap elections or whether it's card check and getting rid of a secret ballot, there doesn't seem to be a concern that there is an actual legitimate fair election held to determine whether an employer, a group of employees decide to unionize. I mean, it seems like they don't care about the fairness of the process.
Well, and in fact, at the time that the NLRB was proposing these rules, they did admit that they were doing to try to remove quote-unquote unnecessary barriers in response to union complaints about delays in elections. But as Bob mentioned, currently the election time is only 38 to 42 days on average. Those are pretty quick elections. So now they want to reduce that to 10 days, giving employers really only 7 days to try to educate their employers. Again, it goes back to some of the comments we made during the first show that clearly the intent behind this is to remove the employers from the election process. They don't want the employers to be able to provide any input to their employees on what this really means. And in fact, the one Republican that sits on the NLRB, actually he was quoted, its Republican member Hayes noted that this new proposed rule is merely a transparent attempt to limit both the employer's ability to contest union election issues and its legitimate opportunity to communicate its own views about unionization with employees. So he was voting against this because he knew what the NLRB was doing and told the press, you know, this is their apparent attempt to keep the employers out of the process. So it raises serious concerns for employers.
And you mentioned a few moments ago, Bob, that this is called rulemaking. And when a executive branch organization creates a rule, and in a sense, they are creating law through their rules, there's a process for people to comment on that. And I can only assume that the reason for the process is that if a rule they're making is meeting a lot of resistance, maybe they need to retract and go back and look at that. The rule should simply be enacting the spirit of the law that was passed. Yet, according to the National Association of Manufacturers, one of the more recent rules or sets of rules they put forth, there were tens of thousands of comments made against it, and yet they still proceed forward. I mean, this seems to be far outside the spirit of what the rulemaking process is there for.
I think that's right, and one of the things that's really noteworthy, particularly with the proposed rulemaking on the snap elections, is that the Republican member Brian Hayes took the unusual step of actually writing a dissent. The way it works in the rulemaking process is the board essentially writes an introduction. It's not just the actual proposed regulations. So they write 8 or 10 pages describing what they see as the need for the changes. And member Hayes wrote a dissent where he flat out acknowledged that the only thing the board is trying to do is make it easier for unions to win more elections. And that is just unprecedented in my 20 years of practicing as a labor lawyer.
Well, we are out of time for this episode, but we're going to be back next week, and we're going to talk specifically about the Boeing case, perhaps the most well-known case as it pertains to recent actions by the National Labor Relations Board, but I think it certainly illustrates the great divide in this nation on how we are proceeding forward with labor issues. So for my guests, thank you, by the way, for being here so much, Bob Sullivan and Laura Lee Blake. I'm Chip Rogers from AAHOA, and if you'd like to reach me, you can email me, chip@ahoa.com. That's chip@ahoa.com. Until next week, so long, we'll see you again.